This is my new Patreon series number 38. We're going to take a look at Yeshua's teachings on death, afterlife, and reincarnation. Some of these are found in the New Testament Gospels. Others are found in the Gospel of Thomas, which most scholars have recognized as being a repository of authentic sayings of Yeshua, although they have been spun in a Gnostic mode, just as the New Testament sayings were spun in their own anti-Semitic mode. So these teachings on death and afterlife and reincarnation are very much consistent with what was taught in Judaism and what I call Kabbalistic Judaism, or scholars very often call Proto-Kabbalistic Judaism, the inner teachings of rabbis that we still have preserved from many sources at the time of Yeshua. Now we're going to talk first about the Kima and Gehenna and life after death, and these are things that I've touched on in other presentations and will go more in detail on in my presentations on the Gospel of Thomas, which are going to be thoroughly presented in 2019. But Yeshua taught the Kabbalistic view of the Pharisaic sages, that those who were righteous in life would awaken after death in the paradise, or the pardes, of the third heaven as standing ones, or immortal saints in the Kima, or re-arising, or resurrection, which, by the way, was for all Tzaddikim, or Jewish saints. As Mark 12:25 says, for when they rise from the dead, they neither marry, they're neither male, nor are given in marriage, or female, but are like unto the angels in heaven. The angels were considered to be like God, without gender or containing both genders. Angels and all divine beings are considered to be perfect, that is, tam, and complete or whole, shalem, and thus are portrayed allegorically as hermaphroditic, or male-female, including Godhead, the Abba. Here is a hymn about the Kima of the righteous from the 1st century Pharisaic Apocalypse of Baruch, which was contemporary with Yeshua. It may have been one of the hymns sung by Yeshua and the disciples during his Shabbat Seder, which was a mystic participation in the marriage banquet of Messiah. Note the Kabbalistic terminology and the parallel to Yeshua's statement about like unto the angels. But those who have been saved by their works, note that they're saved by their works, not by belief or creed, and to whom the Torah has now been a hope and understanding, or bina, an expectation, and wisdom, chachma, a confidence, those who have been saved shall, after their death, shall wonders appear in their time. For they shall behold the world which is now invisible to them, and they shall behold the time which is now hidden from them, and time shall no longer age them. So their consciousness is continuous after they die, and they now have the ability to see through time and exist through time. For in the heights of that olam is the world of God, they shall dwell, and they shall be made like unto the angels. This is the very term that Yeshua used in Mark 12:25, like unto the angels in heaven. And they shall be made equal to the stars, and they shall be changed into every form they desire, from beauty into loveliness, and from light, or into the splendor of glory. That's I'm taking that from 1 Baruch 51, edited by Charles, and you can access that online at the following link. Now, Yeshua taught another doctrine of the sages, the doctrine of Gehenna, which is not the Christian hell or the Orphic Hades. Yeshua taught this Kabbalistic doctrine. After death, all souls undergo a purgatorial state, Gehenna, but it lasts for a maximum of 12 months for the most evil lives, but only a few hours or days for most souls, depending upon the defilement of the soul, according to first century rabbinic sources contemporary with Yeshua. And Yeshua taught his own disciples how to avoid Gehenna altogether by purifying themselves in their lives each day. That was purification from self-generated moral and spiritual defilements. It was not a punishment for sin. Gehenna was a place of purification. He taught his disciples practices of self-examination and compassion to purify their souls and physical life so that they could bypass the need for after-death purification in Gehenna, which was located in the west of Eden, in the third heaven. And he says that if your one hand causes you a misgol, a stumbling block or a sin, cut off your hand, for it is better for you if you enter Chaya Olam, that is the life of the Olam, the life of the heavenly world, as an amputee, than having both hands you go away into Gehenna, into the Eish Lo Tichba, the fire not ever extinguished. And that's a conscious reference to the terminology in Isaiah 66, where there are tolat lo tamut, where their worm or maggots do not die. That's from Isaiah 66. And if your foot causes you a misgol, cut off your foot. It is better for you to enter Chaya, the life of Chola Olam, the life of the Olam, lame. So we find that in Mark and the Gospels. This is much different than the eternal damnation of Christian theology, which makes statements like, when people reject Jesus Christ as Lord God Almighty, they go directly into hell, and so on. This is an entirely different concept than the Orphic idea of hell, which was the basis for the later Christian doctrine of hell. And then after this, after purification in Gehenna, normal souls sleep in the third heaven awaiting reincarnation, which was known as Gilgul, the cycles of returns. But the souls of the righteous awaken and abide in the divine Olam of God, full consciousness. And there they no longer reincarnate, and they progress into higher and higher states. So death and Gilgul, or reincarnation, were very prominent in first century Jewish thought. Normal death was thought to be merely sleep in shalom of the pardes, in the peace of the pardes. But the Tzaddikim, the Jewish saints, reawaken in the pardes in Kima, in the resurrection. What they later called the anastasis, the resurrection, but it means the standing forth, like unto the angels, who have no need for Gilgul or reincarnation, and eventually they evolve and ascend into the 8th and 9th heavens, where they telepathically guide advanced human souls. This is the very same doctrine that we find, by the way, taught at the same time in the same period in the Hermetic mysteries. The most spiritually evolved beings, like Enoch, stand as divine beings like the archangels, and Enoch evolved into Metatron, who oversees reincarnation, according to the Jewish Haggadah. About reincarnation, Yeshua said John was a reincarnation of Elijah. Messianic Jews and many early Christian churches taught reincarnation. Here's a book you might enjoy. It's by Rabbi Vital, based on the teachings of Rabbi Vital. It's by Wexelman. It's called The Jewish Concept of Reincarnation and Creation. Now, proto-Kabbalistic teaching is that all except the Tzaddikim, the righteous ones, and remember that this term underlies Paul's term of justification, or dikaiosune, all except the righteous ones enter into Gehenna for final purification after death, and then into the Chima, or into the sleep of the Pardes. The Catholic doctrine is that after death, human souls are either cast into hell for eternal damnation or enter purgatory to prepare for paradise, to be made purified. The Christian idea of eternal hell developed from the Orphic idea of Hades. The Catholic purgatory is what the development of the Jewish Gehenna became. So when you think Catholic purgatory, you're getting much closer to the concept of Gehenna that Yeshua was using. By the way, it was a medieval moneymaker. The Pope could shorten the days in purgatory for special services to the church, meaning big donations of money. They were called indulgences, and they were part of the corruption of the church that Martin Luther and many other people spoke against. Let's take a look at Logian 85 in the Gospel of Thomas. The human archetype is a microcosm of a macrocosm. In other words, humanity is a universe. It's a microcosm or a holistic piece of the entire universe. Yeshua says in the Gospel of Thomas, Adam, meaning Adam Kadmon, and this is the original Adam, the concept of Adam, or of mankind, humanity, and Adam means humanity, came into being with marvelous endowments from a great heavenly host. Remember, he was created by the Elohim, and the Elohim were the high archangelic beings that did the actual work of creation of the body of Adam Kadmon. So he came into being with marvelous endowments from a great heavenly host, but he did not become worthy of you, those who are part of the new humanity. If he had been worthy, he would not have experienced death. And the implication is that you do not need to experience death either. Now, Genesis 1:26 specifies that Adam was constructed, and that's the term, not created, constructed by the consent and activity of the Yahweh Elohim. That is God Almighty's gods, the high gods that serve Yahweh. Yeshua indicates that primal humanity was created from all the macrocosmic intelligences and energies and attributes of the archangelic sovereignties, or the Elohim. Science tells us we are evolutions of stardust. We are perhaps the highest evolution of consciousness in the universe. The phrase, but he, Adam, did not become worthy of you, has several implications. It doesn't say he was not worthy, but he did not become worthy, implying that one can become worthy. Worthiness is moral and spiritual. It's not something one is born possessing, but earns in life through self-liberation, becoming, the term is perfect or tam, and achieving rebirth into the new Adam or new humanity, which is the process that Yeshua taught. Self-rebirth. Let's take a look at Logian 70. When you beget that one you have within your hearts, he will perfect you. If you do not bring forth that one within your hearts, what you have failed to develop within your hearts will kill you. The Coptic verb of the first clause is jepo, which means to beget or bring to birth. This is consistent with Yeshua's inner circle teachings about the birth from above, which in Greek is often understood as rebirth or regeneration. The Coptic phrase meaning inside or within derives from the Aramaic idiom within the heart. The heart was the abode of the Kabbalistic image, or Zelem, that produced the good Yetzer of God and the place where the birth from above occurs. Now, the Coptic Pei specifies that one. I have capitalized one to clarify its meaning. It is the Bar Enosh, the Pauline's second Adam or Christ that must be begotten in the heart. If you beget that one in the heart, he will perfect you. The Coptic verb is tujet, which occurs only once in the sayings of Thomas, but represents the Aramaic verb shalom, to behold, perfect, to be whole, perfect, complete, and finished. To become shalem, or spiritually perfected, was the goal of Yeshua's halakha, of spiritual rebirth. This is incorrectly translated by many scholars as he or it will save you, but neither the Coptic nor the original Aramaic word means to save. It means to perfect. The next clause, if you do not bring forth that one, does not repeat the Coptic word for begetting. Rather, it is the acmimic form, which is a very general verb meaning everything from give, bring, to pay, go toward, lay upon, fight with, pursue. I use the phrase bring forth, but it has a sense of interact with or struggle with, and perhaps best something like to develop or increase. If you do not pay heed to and honor that one, then what you have failed to develop in your hearts will spiritually kill you. This is consistent with Yeshua's davarim, such as those who have, to those who have, more will be given, but to those who lack or have not, even what they have will be taken away. Now I want to review with you the shape of the pre-Kabbalistic or proto-Kabbalistic self as it was understood in Yeshua's time. One had this body, the basar, the flesh, the physical body. It was known as the basar. But it also had contained within that body a personality, a lower mind. So in later senses, it would be understood as an astral body or sidereal body. It was called the nephesh. And that survived the death of the physical body for some 40 days or so, depended on different things with different people. And then it was dissolved back into its own cosmic elements as the higher bodies or the higher selves would ascend into their higher components. The soul, the neshama, we can use the word soul, is the permanent part of the human being, and that is what survives death, and it carries with it all the imprints that a human has made, the moral imprints in terms of what has been done that is good and that is evil, and it carries the imprints for what will become the karmic consequences of sin in future lives. Now, the matrix between the soul and the higher bodies is known as spirit, ruach. I've represented it here with this symbol. Now there is a higher mind. It is the mind of Christ, known in Greek to Paul as the nous, and known as in Hebrew or in Aramaic as manas. And it was known in other traditions as manas as well. And it's called the chaya, which is the higher mind, and that is the, so to speak, the mind that of the soul. And then at the very crown, the divine self, the individual monad, was called the yachida. And notice that these are all feminine terms, except for basar. They all end in AH. Now I'm going to review with you what my own Kabbalistic constitution might look like. Here's me in my flesh, my basar. That's going to pass away. I'm going to die. That body is going to change, and it's eventually going to no longer be able to keep my soul happy, and it's no longer going to be able to function for me, and it will I will die, and the body will dissolve back into its physical components. This is the nephesh, the personality, the lower mind. That part will survive death for weeks or days or maybe months, but it too will eventually dissolve back into its constituent elements. So that's gone. Now, there are two possible ways that I have connection between my soul and my higher structures. If I've built a good connection, then that's what we're going to look at here. If I build a poor connection, then I will not have consciousness. Then when I die, I will be unconscious, just in a dream state. But if I have continuity of consciousness, this is what I might experience. In this realm, which is called Ruach, or spirit, this is the realm that is the angelic realm. Everything is genderless or hermaphroditic, as depending upon what kind of allegory one wants to use. And there is no longer male or female. So the neshama, or the soul, carries with it the imprints of what it has done in the previous life after the body and the nefesh die. And the chaya is the higher mind. That is the mind of the soul. That is the known as the mind of Christ. It is the higher intuitive, much greater, more expansive consciousness that is not normally accessible to our lower mind and our lower consciousness. And then above that is the Yahida, the divine spark, and that is usually represented as fire or as a spark. And that is an aspect of Godhead that is embedded in the human constitution. So if, in fact, we reincarnate, that is known as Gilgul, we will reincarnate from that point. It is the Yahida that will send down the divine spark into flesh and develop a new body, and a new neshama will develop. Not a new neshama, but a new nefesh will develop. But the neshama will continue on and will obtain imprints of the life that is given that time. And this process of reincarnation, or Gilgul, is overseen by the archangel Metatron, who is considered to have been Enoch in his last incarnation. Yahid is the masculine term for the divine Zelim. That is the divine image of God, which is represented up here with Yod He Vav He, Yahweh. And when there is a union that is restored between Yahid and Yahida, we have what was thought of by the Jewish mystics as the divine marriage, the Hieros. Yeshua was a peripatetic teacher. He walked from place to place, and his disciples walked with him. He also was very often on the move in order to avoid the forces of Herod, the Herodians, who were trying to catch him in something so that they could have him executed, as they had succeeded in doing for John the Baptist. And so his own life was a life of what we might call absolute awareness of impermanence. And this concept is something that we find in several of his sayings. The shortest saying that we find recorded of Yeshua is this one: become passers-by. Become those who don't stay attached to one place or one thing. It is a Kabbalistic concept of kihesh, which I can translate very easily as non-attachment or impermanence. Kihesh means not to allow yourself to be emotionally attached and invested in anything material, in anything earthly. It's also known in Buddhism, by the way, by the same term as non-attachment. Now, Israel had learned from harsh experience in the diaspora uh, that their lives could at any time be turned upside down by the vagaries of their host kingdom. They were living in a land, but it was not outside their land. They had to carry their own land with them, inside them. That came across later in the early Christian communities who talked about themselves as living not as citizens of this earth, but as citizens of heaven and so on. So like the ancient Hebrew nomads, no matter how secure and welcome and settled they might feel, a time would come when they would need to be uprooted and become travelers once again in search of a homeland. And Yeshua tells his disciples that this is the existential condition of mankind and of his halakha. The only remedy for impermanence is non-attachment to the illusions of material reality. And we find another saying of his that emphasizes this here in the Gospel of Thomas. Logan 86 repeats the saying that we find also in the Q source in Matthew and Luke, which is, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man, the Son of mankind, the Son of humanity, the new humanity, the Bar Nash, has nowhere to lay his head. In other words, the earth is the life of the earth, its politics, its consciousness among humanity and so on, is not copacetic to the heavenly new humanity that is being rebirthed or being birthed here on the earth within the hearts of each of his disciples and each of his followers. So he cautions them that do not expect to feel welcome when you are here or to feel copacetic. You will always be living among contradictions. Only in the tikkun, in the final state of return, will Christed humanity have a permanent home on earth. So the disciples must free themselves from attachment to the ways of the world, the flesh, and the prince of this world, as he was called in the teachings of Yeshua, which is ultimately the evil impulse, the bad yetzer that dominates the hearts of most humanity. So this is very important, because in order to understand the teachings of Yeshua about death and afterlife and so on, we have to understand this concept of impermanence. Now let's take a look at Logian 112. Woe to the flesh, because it depends upon the soul, but woe to the soul if it depends upon or clings to the flesh. Literally, it's woe to the flesh that depends upon the soul, and woe to the soul that depends upon the flesh. But what it means is the flesh depends upon the soul. Without a soul, there would not be an incarnation. There would not be life in flesh. But woe to the soul if it depends upon the flesh or clings to the flesh. The neshama can be either sanctified or defiled by the nephesh, the lower personality, in its choices and in what it does. Will either sanctify the soul or it will defile the soul. So the soul is vulnerable to what the incarnate personality decides to do. Now, flesh is emanated from the spiritual principles of the world of Yetzirah, or the world of formation, ultimately from Yechida, and thus depends upon the soul. it can't come into being without the soul, because that's its origin. But the nephesh can ignore and defile the soul, and thus woe to that soul. Here we have a case one about death, in which the nephesh clings to the dead person, or the dead personality. The soul depends on the flesh. This is the case of spiritually dead or undeveloped people, or such a person, so that after death, the nephesh itself clings to that person, doesn't want to recognize that it's dead, doesn't want to leave the physical life. It's in grief, and it does not want to let go and dissolve so that the death can be completed. Case two, the nephesh releases the body easily. For example, Yeshua on the cross dies quickly. And in a spiritually developed person, the nephesh does not cling to the body, and it allows itself to go through its process and enter into Gehenna and be dissolved and be purified. Let's take a look at Logion 87. The personality of flesh, that is the nephesh, that clings to the flesh, basar, will waste away, and the soul, or neshama, that is attached to these two will become desolate. Literally, it says shattered is the subtle body that clings to a physical body. Shattered is the nephesh that clings to the basar. And shattered is the soul that is attached to these two. And what does this imply? It's the case of one who is divided, or who is, to use Yeshua's Aramaic term, se'ef, disconnected from his soul or spiritual realities. That's the case of being divided, or having a double soul. Double-souled is the way it's expressed in Greek. A person who is double-souled. That's a case of one who is se'ef, or disconnected from his soul and spiritual realities. Here's an example of someone like that. Charles Manson. The nephesh will try to avoid the second death after the death of the body, or the second death is the dissolution of the nephesh, which releases the neshama into the spiritual worlds, usually after about 40 days, by draining vital force. And this attempt to avoid the second death of the nephesh, or the astral body, is accomplished by draining vital force from living beings through obsession or possession. So the theory was that the undead, those who had died but had refused to move on, drained vital force from the living in order to maintain their status, their consciousness. And that those who do that, and the soul of the one who does that, accumulates a great burden of hub, or spiritual debt, or bad karma, as we would say. So even after the death, one can create more spiritual debt, more bad karma. Nevertheless, the nephesh must, whether it likes it or not, must eventually dissolve, but any continuity of consciousness will be lost at that time. The soul of such a person, or neshama, will suffer many weeks of purifying fire in the Gehenna of the third heaven. And it will be experienced as a suffering. Then it will fall asleep in the Pardes, in paradise. It cannot awaken in the Chema. It cannot be a conscious being with continuity of consciousness, but rather an unconscious being who suffers after death eventually, and then goes to sleep awaiting reincarnation with all the imprints of not only uh, the wrong and bad actions of its nephesh in life, but also of its nephesh afterlife. The immortal Yehida will emanate another physical incarnation through the neshama, but this new incarnation will be burdened with hub, or the consequences of sin, and it will face a difficult path in life. And we can understand that as bad karma as opposed to suffering caused by the sin or hata and injustice of others or of collective sin. That is a term for sin in Aramaic, hata, which is not to be confused with hub in the Lord's Prayer when he says, releases from hub, it releases from the consequences of sin, and to actually sin is to commit hata, an offense. So let's continue with this concept. The discarnate personality, the nephesh, or the so-called astral or sidereal body, dissolves back into its etheric elements about 40 days after death to release its higher spiritual principles. So this is what is known as the second death. This Devar says that just as the flesh dissolves after death, the nephesh that clings to flesh will also dissolve regardless of how much it tries to avoid it. It will dissolve involuntarily. The soul, the neshama of a spiritually dead person will be left desolate without a conscious connection. That's what it means, and the soul will be desolate. This is what Yeshua refers to as loss of soul. He says, what profit it if a man gain the whole world and lose his own soul? This is the meaning of loss of soul. When one has become so disconnected, one's life and flesh, one's personality, one's consciousness, one's actions, and have no compass, no moral compass in life anymore, then when the person dies, he, so to speak, loses his soul. His soul becomes desolate without a conscious connection. In the case of a true disciple, however, his consciousness will withdraw into the neshama through the sulam, or heavenly staircase, of ruach, or spirit, because spiritual integration has been accomplished in the works of incarnate life. Yeshua taught people to purify themselves in daily life through prayer and consciousness and compassion, and stay connected, keep connected to the promptings of the higher spiritual forces and the soul. Now, the sulam that I just spoke of is a Kabbalistic interpretation of Jacob's vision of the ladder with the angels ascending and descending, and it was part of pre-Kabbalistic mysticism that one had this connection that went all the way from one's physical body or consciousness into the higher heavens. And it was known as and some people call it the staircase to heaven. And that was the origin of that concept, the sulam. And Yeshua said, Amen, amen, I say unto you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of the Abba descending and ascending and descending upon, that's in Greek, that's epi, for the Hebrew al, above, near, in respect to, in cooperation with. That meaning descending upon the Son of Man, the Baranash, the new humanity, John 1:51. And the meaning of that is that you will one day be able to see the sulam, and you'll be able to see the connection, the spiritual connection in ruach of the angelic uh, guidance and force that is always coming to and helping and guiding one who has rebirthed himself as a Bar Anash, as the new humanity, a son of mankind. Let's take a look at Logian 88, which is right next to this. He talks about what his disciples will experience after death. And that is assuming they have built this connection and purified their souls. He says, the angels and the prophets will come to you and give to you those things you already have, and you will reciprocate by offering them those things which you have, and say to yourselves, when will they come and take what is theirs? Well, that may sound pretty strange, but I can explain it to you pretty easily, I think. There was a convention of gift giving and receiving in the Near East, and at the time of Yeshua. And it was that when one entered into another's home, he was given gifts. He was given food, drink, hospitality, perhaps other gifts. And then he then would reciprocate by offering gifts to the host. So you would come to somebody's home or somebody's place or somebody's country, and you would give gifts to the people who ruled it or who were in charge of it, and they would give gifts to you. And that was the convention of gift giving. So he says, and the angels and the prophets after death in the heavenly context will come to you and give you those things you already have. What are those things you already have? Well, those are the things that you have developed. Your charisms, your spiritual powers, your compassion, your all of the qualities of God that you have developed within yourself. So when a disciple is welcomed into the body of Baranash after death, so to speak, the body meaning the assembly, he will be given gifts just as Adam Kadmon or Adam Kadmon was given marvelous endowments from a great heavenly host. And these gifts, which are sovereignties or rulerships, are based on what they already have or possess. In other words, what they have earned and developed in their life and flesh. And it says, and you will reciprocate by offering them those things which you have, and say to yourselves, when will they come and take what is theirs? So you will want to offer back what has been given. So what can the disciples offer? They can reciprocate only by offering the treasure they have accumulated in their hearts. That's all you can take with you when you die, the positive and negative things that you have accumulated in your heart. But the angels and the prophets of heaven do not come to accept the treasures. Why not? Why do they not come to accept the treasures? Why can't you give back these things? Because the Abba and those dwelling in the eternal Olam do not lack, as it's said in several other sayings. They are whole, perfect, and completely without need. They have no need. You can't give anything to God. You can't give anything to the heavenly beings. They already have everything. So this is what we call a measure for measure statement. With the same measure you give to others in life, you will receive after death, as Yeshua says. But for those who hear and practice my halakha of spiritual rebirth, even more will be received after death. So this is a concept that Yeshua gives to his disciples about what they can expect after the death of the physical body if they follow his halakha. So we need to look at the concept, the Kabbalistic concept of the Gnostic robe of glory. It is actually not a Gnostic concept. Yeshua says, "Who would add to your stature? It is the one who will give you your clothing." When Yeshua said, "If God so clothe the grass or lilies of the valley, how much more will he clothe you?" he referred to the Kabbalistic robe of righteousness. And so his login 36, where he says, "Who would add to your stature? It is the one who will give you your clothing." Well, that is God. God will give you your clothing, and your stature is your spiritual rank. Joseph's coat of many colors from the Old Testament stories provided the Kabbalistic allegory. It was interpreted that way by the sages. The concept first appeared in the Babylonian Trito-Isaiah. In Messianic interpretation, this would become the heavenly raiment worn by the Zaddikim of the Kemah. This would become the robe of righteousness worn by the righteous ones in the arising after death. Trito-Isaiah 61 says, "I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, my soul shall," and Lord all capitalized means is the word Yahweh. "I will greatly rejoice in the Abba. My soul shall be joyful in my God, for he hath clothed me with the garments of salvation. He hath covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decketh himself with a garland, and as a bride adorneth herself with her jewels." And this is the concept of the Messianic marriage and being bedecked with the many colored robe of righteousness. Who would add to your stature? It is the one who will give you your clothing. Well, Paul's spiritual body that he spoke about, his soma pneumatikon, represents an early Christian adaptation of this concept. All these were Kabbalistic antecedents to the Gnostic multifaceted royal robe of glory, which we're going to discuss now, because that is rooted in the teachings of Yeshua about the robe of righteousness after death. The hymn of the pearl, which we find in the Acts of Thomas, which is also part of the Thomas traditions, describes the perfected soul's return to heaven after successfully completing its mission to recover the pearl, or original divine identity that has been lost in the bondage of fleshly incarnation. As this person, this perfected being, ascends after death, his robe of glory rushes to him and envelops his soul. And we're going to use a translation by G.R.S. Mead from the old Syriac text in his book, The Hymn of the Robe of Glory, which you can get online at this address I've given you. Here's what it says in the Acts of Thomas, the Hymn of the Pearl. "The glorious robe, all bespangled with sparkling splendor of colors, with gold and also with beryls and chalcedonies, iris-hued things which probably are opals, with sards of varying colors to match its grandeur, and moreover it had been completed with adamantine jewels, and all of its seams were oft fashioned." So this is a royal robe. It's covered with things like precious stones and so on. Moreover, the King of Kings image was depicted entirely all over it. So the face of God is turned toward this person. As with the sapphires above, was it wrought in a motley of color. The idea that the heavenly world rests upon an ocean of sapphire. "I saw that moreover all over it the motions of gnosis abounding." That would be manda, abounding. I saw it further was making ready as though for to speak. So here's a robe that has an image on it, face on it, and it can talk to you. I heard the sound of music, which it whispered as it descended. Behold him, the active in deeds, for whom I was reared with my Father. In other words, the robe was being prepared in heaven for this person who has perfected himself on earth. He has recovered the pearl. He has recovered himself. He has made himself one with his soul and the higher principles. He's active in deeds. He's righteous in deeds, for whom I was reared with my Father. In other words, the robe was like a child in heaven that was being reared or brought up in the presence of God. I too, the robe says, have felt in myself how that with his works waxed my stature. So the robe says, the one who is active in deeds, the one who is dispatched to the earth in flesh and overcame, his works, his activeness in deeds and righteousness, waxed my stature. It caused me to mature and grow greater and greater. And now, with its kingly motions, was it pouring itself out towards me, and made haste in the hands of its givers, that I might take and receive it. So here you are receiving that which you already have. And me too, my love, urged forward to run for to meet it, to take it, because he was drawn to it. And I stretched myself forth to receive it with its beauty of color. I decked me, and my mantle of sparkling colors I wrapped entirely all o'er me. Now this becomes what he is, and how he would appear in the Olam of God. I clothed me therewith and ascended to the gate of greeting and homage. I bowed my head and did homage to the glory of him who had sent it, whose commands I now had accomplished, and who had too done what he'd promised. And there at the gate of his house sons, that was the ones who lived with him always, so the Elohim, I mingled myself with his princes. These are the Elohim. For he had received me with gladness, and I was with him in his sovereignty. Now, Yeshua's teachings on death were lost in Christianity. They're not part of modern Christian doctrine, and they're not part of Catholic doctrine or anything else except possibly theosophical Christian doctrine and so on. They were preserved only in the Thomasian, that is the Thomas traditions, and some other Gnostic traditions of the 2nd and 3rd century. And that's why we still have references to them. The Christian teachings on death and heaven and hell were derived from Orphic and other Hellenistic religious fundamentalism. And by the term fundamentalism, I mean the sort of popular religion that posited the existence of a hell in which one would be tormented and tortured. Now, Yeshua's teachings derived from Second Temple Jewish proto-Kabbalistic Haggadah, the Aramaic Targums, which were commentaries on biblical texts that were read in the synagogues of Yeshua's hometown, where he grew up in Nazareth and so on, and other inner circle teachings of Jewish sages. That is the influence, and that is what is reflected in the teachings of Yeshua. You can find all of the Aramaic Targum sources online by searching resurrection in John Granger Cook's comprehensive academic study entitled Empty Tomb Resurrection Apotheosis on Amazon. And you can, this is the link I'm giving you right here, and this is a photo of this book, his book, because it's an excellent study, and it puts together all these sources that would have would have been influential and had much to influence about Yeshua's thinking about uh, death and afterlife. Or you can buy the book for around 200 bucks. I don't suggest doing that when you can just go online and search for what you want to find out. In 2019, I plan to upload my workshop on the Kabbalistic words of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas that I gave live in my home to advanced students soon after publishing my book 10 years ago. This is the cover of that book, The Kabbalistic Words, which is available to people through Patreon as a reward, or can just be purchased online, or I just sell them at my workshops. The workshop presents detailed discussion of all 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. So it will be uploaded over several months, and it'll be a very detailed academic study. Now, I have uploaded this month, as my second upload for my Patreon uploads, a basic introduction to the Gospel of Thomas, so that you should view that to prepare for the workshop that I'll be uploading in January 2019. So some of it may repeat things you've seen earlier, but there's so much complex information in this and many other things that I sometimes have to repeat slides or narrate slides to explain things. But this basic introduction of the Gospel of Thomas is very important for you to understand why it's so important, why scholars recognize it as a fifth source of the sayings of Yeshua next to the New Testament writings and others and so on, and how important it is for us to understand in terms of many things, in this case, the teachings on death that Yeshua gave.